Josh, can we just talk about someone we don't talk about nearly enough, given his standing in the polls, his consistent standing in the polls, which in some cases might be going up, and his consistent support, which doesn't seem shaken, which is Senator Bernie Sanders, who I think is often overlooked, and he's done nothing except be very consistent.
Well, he is, and if you look at his standing in poll aggregates over the last month, he's risen and risen and risen. He is at least a co-frontrunner or close to it in Iowa. He's at least a co-frontrunner or close to it in New Hampshire. And if all of a sudden Bernie Sanders were to win Iowa, Bernie Sanders would win New Hampshire, that scrambles the whole race. And we're suddenly talking about a guy who, for the most part, despite his longevity, as you mentioned, really isn't talked about much in the context of being a realistic Democratic nominee.
And is extraordinarily consistent in debates.
Yes.
We've seen over this campaign.
And real fast, John, if the race is a true four-way race, that plays to Bernie's advantage. If this vote is carved up 4 or 5 different ways, Bernie's floor is rock solid. He's not going to gain much from what he has, but his floor is solid. And if this is a 4 or 5-way race and he can get his 21%, he'll be very strong in Iowa.
Yep. I wanted to ask you, there seems to be a difference, and I haven't quite got my arms around it yet, between how you do hear that a lot. Man, I would never vote for Elizabeth Warren. But we've seen polls that have shown that Bernie Sanders, for some reason, who calls himself, I mean, he's an avowed socialist and supports many of the same things that Elizabeth Warren supports. I've just never quite understood the difference between those two, why Bernie Sanders actually does better in head-to-head matchups, certainly in the polls we've seen over the past couple of weeks with Donald Trump, than Elizabeth Warren, despite the fact that they share a lot of the same ideological stances.
Well, I think 2 things play in. Some is misogyny, that she's a woman, and they can accept Bernie Sanders as a man saying things that they will not accept this bright, very serious-minded woman. Secondly, I think it's that they do not think in many cases that Bernie could ever be president. And Elizabeth Warren started rising in the polls and became a feasible candidate, so they took it a little more seriously. I think those are the 2 factors.
Bernie got a Bernie. Bernie Sanders is always Bernie Sanders, and while I kind of doubt that Bernie Sanders is going to be the nominee just because of the way the math works out, but I thought he had a pretty decent night too.
Jason, watching these clips, I'm reminded that the phrase purity test was introduced tonight by Mayor Pete. Right. A lot of centrist Democrats find purity testing absolutely maddening.
Right. And here's the thing. First of all, people complain about purity tests usually when they're impure. And that's part of the issue. That's part of the issue.
And I would have said to you, say 30 days ago, that I don't think Bernie Sanders is viable in the 2020 campaign. After listening to these voters in California with more delegates than any other state in the country, I think Bernie Sanders has a good opportunity, good chance to win the primary. And if you win California, you get such a huge share of the delegates now that Kamala Harris is out.
So how do you with?
There were 25 participants. 6 of them walked in there supporting Bernie Sanders. 14 of them walked out saying that he was the big winner of the debate. I think you're going to see continued movement. Sanders has been gaining in California over the past 2 months.
People said Tom Steyer had his best night yet. I mean, you can go down the Bernie Sanders. Bernie, also, a lot of people believe he had a good night. I think we really saw for the first time the impact of having fewer people on the stage, giving each of the candidates more time to talk, and it making a big difference.
You've got this issue, I think, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in a non-aggression pact for most of 2019. Now suddenly looking at each other going, wait a minute, Bernie's resurgent, Warren's lost a little altitude. Both of them have enough money and will continue to have enough money to go all the way through to June. And what that means is that it's going to be very hard for either one of them to consolidate the progressive wing of the party. The total of their vote share comes up to about 40%, and they split that at different times among them in different ways. And what that is bad news if you are a progressive and want to be the nominee, if those two stay all the way to the end, and good news if you're in the center of the party, because you look at those two locked in that kind of death struggle for months. that leaves 60% of the rest of the vote open. And the question then becomes, who does the mainstream, center-left, moderate, whatever you want to call them, who emerges among those other three right now? I mean, there's still opening for someone else to come out of nowhere, but that would be the race right now. But it's a really good question, and it's the case that a lot of people thought either Sanders or Warren by now would have the pole position on the left. Looks like they could be stuck going at each other pretty much throughout the entire race.
The most important part of this debate was very important to me personally as a transgender person, hearing Bernie Sanders say that his health care plan would explicitly cover trans health care.
Leaning and far left-leaning policies that perhaps Elizabeth Warren and perhaps, I don't know, Bernie Sanders have put out there over the past few months. Is the strategy still sound to go after the wealthy, go after the capitalist system in America?
Well, I'm not sure it is. I think candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders who want, well, at least as Elizabeth Warren calls it, quote-unquote, big structural change, have a problem with an economy where the unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. By this time next year, it might be at a 60-year low. Do voters overall think the economy needs big structural change when it's actually been pretty good? Wages have been rising. Wages have actually been rising fastest for lower income workers. Do people want to sort of blow up the system, or are they going to be more interested in a candidate who wants to fix things where there's problems, but otherwise keep our basic capitalist system intact?
What I'm waiting for, and we haven't seen, we've been talking about it for so long, is Warren and Sanders.
Yeah.
You were saying they need to get votes
Yeah.
from each other, and they still have not really fully engaged on that debate stage, and they could be disagreeing about Medicare for all right now, but they're not touching each other.
The stage without Castro or Booker or Kamala Harris, and that this was an opportunity for folks who were on the stage to really make a play for those voters. And instead, we saw Bernie Sanders sort of revert to his 2016 race issues, where he got asked a direct question about race and he tried to pivot to climate change and he got called out on that. He made that joke about also being a white guy, which fell really flat.
As John said, he came out as a white guy last night.
He did. And it was the wrong moment to do that, when we were all sort of feeling the strain of having what had been a really diverse field winnowed to a very white one. So I would say those were real misses. Joe Biden answering
has not come up for us in the last couple of minutes is Bernie Sanders.
I guess his name didn't, but that word revolution certainly did, and that's something Bernie Sanders associates himself with. I think one thing, though, that needs to be kept in mind when we look at Sanders on that stage tonight and his chances going forward, it's this. These are the favorable, unfavorable scores among Democratic voters for all the Democratic candidates. This is from just a couple days ago, and you can see it. Top of the list, the most popular Democratic candidate with Democratic voters, just in terms of favorable, unfavorable. It's Bernie Sanders, 75-18. That's a little bit better than Biden, Warren, Booker, Buttigieg. You go down to the bottom of the list right there. I think it's worth keeping in mind because of this. When you ask Democrats that question we showed earlier on electability, Sanders does not fare well there. But he is different than you would normally think a factional candidate would be, a candidate who's not a registered Democrat, a candidate who embraces the democratic socialism label. You would normally think a candidate like that would have a base and then would have a lot of folks in the party who are opposed to him. But what you see here is folks in the Democratic Party, they almost all know who he is, and three-quarters of them have a favorable view of him. I think it's worth keeping in mind if there is a scenario where Sanders can somehow win Iowa. You've been talking about how important that is. If he could win Iowa and he could win New Hampshire, there might be a lot of Democrats out there around the country who like him and who get on the bandwagon in that situation.
I have to say, we have only one former Democratic senator here in the room, and before I run to a break, you were shaking your head, Senator.
Well, here's the thing. If you look at the unfavorables on all those candidates, they're about the same. The difference is Biden and Bernie are much higher because they're so much better known. But all of the unfavorables are 18, 21, 19, 16. There's not a huge difference in the unfavorables, except for Bloomberg, which is a little different. But I think one of the things you got to remember is what drives your negatives, what drives down your favorable are negative ads. It's negative campaigning. And Hillary Clinton made a conscious decision to not run negative ads on Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has never really, to my knowledge, had a negative ad run against him. No one is really attacking Bernie Sanders. So if he were to emerge as the front runner, what's going to naturally happen in a campaign, fair or unfair, all of a sudden the negative would start. And I think that would maybe then begin to reflect more accurately what the electability thing says. I could be wrong, but I think there is a reason why both Joe and Bernie are so high in favorability and about the same in negative, and that is we haven't started the negative ads yet.
And that's why we invited a woman who has been in the arena to be part of our family here tonight. A break for our coverage. More of this kind of thing when we come right back.
You have a special...
Talking most about the future was actually Andrew Yang. And I saw this division. I think Bernie Sanders was really fading in this campaign. He has a lot of old ideas. And Elizabeth Warren has a lot of old ideas. She says, I have a plan, but we used to call that central planning. That's something that went out with the Bolsheviks. And yet Andrew Yang keeps talking about the future.
Bernie Sanders is running surprisingly well among Latinos. I mean, Latino Decisions have polling here, the best Democratic firm, where Bernie is leading among Latinos. There's been polling in Nevada where he's leading, polling in Texas where he's leading. He got 46% of the vote in California.
Why isn't there more talk about him?
Well, because I think people view Bernie as kind of operating in a narrow framework. I mean, the floor is strong and the ceiling is strong. And so we'll see. But it is possible that as the diversity kind of emerges, you could see a split between the states with a large African-American population. And if Sanders can continue to be strong, he may do well in the states with a larger Hispanic.
One of the things we didn't ask Elizabeth Warren, but Bernie's resurgence, and he has had a little resurgence in recent months, it's a real problem for her.
Yes.
I mean, her bet was that she could consolidate the left.
Yeah.
What's very clear now is that Bernie Sanders isn't going anywhere.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
It's the worst possible situation for the left wing of this party. His ceiling, Bernie's ceiling, is too high for him to be the nominee, but his floor is too low for him to walk away.
Yeah.
So he's in this little band.
Yeah. Well, you heard what Buttigieg said in his forgiveness or gift thing.
Yeah.
He said, whenever one of these people, one of us wins, the rest of us have to get on, and it can't be slow. I mean, that was a message that should resonate with Bernie.
A vision for. So that took me aback. But then I was heartened by seeing what the rest of the candidates did. So we saw Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg bring in the human face of what immigration is. So not just about DACA, but looking at the crisis at the border where we're seeing children separated, pulled from the arms of their mothers. So speaking about that.
Until Super Tuesday. But while all those skirmishes happen, Brian, it's important to also pay attention to the consistent message from Senator Bernie Sanders. He is often sometimes seen as an outlier on the stage, but in polling, he is consistently second or near the top of the many polls in both early states and nationally. And he has a base, and he has shown after his heart attack a reinvigorated campaign. And he's moving forward in a powerful position nationally with the base he helped establish in 2016. Notable also, Senator Sanders talking about race tonight, trying to address African-American voters and voters of color, an issue he struggled on at times in 2016.
Pete Buttigieg bring in the human face to have a response for, that you have to have a vision for. So that took me aback. But then I was heartened by seeing what the rest of the candidates did. So we saw Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg bring in the human face of what immigration is. So not just about DACA, but looking at the crisis at the border where we're seeing children separated, pulled from the arms of their mothers. So speaking about that, we saw Tom
are now only 45 days before the Iowa caucuses. Allison?
Somehow it does just keep getting closer, those Iowa caucuses. It's incredible how time mooches on, as my uncle would say. We will break down the winners and losers from last night next.
Does he really say mooches?
Yes, mooches on. Yes.